Good afternoon, everyone. It's now 12 o'clock. We'll wait a couple more minutes and we'll get started. Okay, everyone, it is now 2 minutes after the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. This is Rob Foster. I am the ACM sales engineer for the Central Region. And today we're going to talk about partitions, roles, delegations, and routing groups. I'm going to sprinkle in a little access groups in there as well. So let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, so objectives for today. We're going to review roles and all the components involved with roles. Then I'm going to do a demo. We'll go through roles, delegations, access groups, routing groups, so on and so forth. Then we're going to come back and talk a little bit about partitions. And then I'll do a short demo on partitions. And then, of course, we will end with questions and answers. Same format as usual. If you have questions during the presentation, feel free to submit those in the chat. And then at the end of the presentation, we will unmute everyone and you can feel free to ask questions verbally as well. Okay, so let's dive in here to roles. So when we talk about roles, we need to start out by talking about what a role is. So something to keep in mind with roles is a role by itself does not grant an identity access or permissions to ACM. It's what's contained inside the role that actually gives the identity permissions to ACM. So those individual permissions that are contained within the role, of course, are access groups, which is probably what you all use most in your roles. Then, of course, delegations, routing groups, and the ability to assign roles to other identities. So just to take a look at the hierarchy of a role, one of the things that's different with ACM versus maybe some other access control systems you all are familiar with is access groups don't get assigned directly to identities. Access groups are assigned to roles, and then roles are assigned to the identity. And same with delegations, routing groups, and of course the ability to assign roles to other identities. So here's the way I like to look at roles. I like to look at roles as a toolbox. So a toolbox by itself really doesn't do anything for you. It's the tools that are inside the toolbox that actually make it something useful. So in this little infographic here, we've got access groups, designated as the hammer, because that's probably the most commonly used tool in access groups. Groups are probably the most commonly used portion of roles. So just a good way to remember the toolbox by itself does not do anything. It's the tools inside that are important. So tips and tricks when we talk about roles, just like you've seen in many other demonstrations that we've had over the past month, roles must be installed, just like access groups. If you don't install the role, it will not work. Something else to remember, by default, when you create a role, the default stop date is 1 year from the start date. So if your end user doesn't plan to use that expiration feature, make sure you set that stop date, to sometime in the future, but do not go beyond January 18th, 2038. If you want to understand why, you can Google Y2K38, and there's a lot of information out on that will give you more explanation for that reason. So also, most of your roles will only contain access groups. So consider prefacing the role name with possibly a P for physical access permissions, and then maybe your roles that grant logical access permissions, through delegations and routing groups. Then maybe consider using an L in front of that name, or whatever nomenclature works best for you. But it's just good to have something in the name that indicates what that role does. Also, it suggests limiting the use of parent-child relationships with roles. This option is available where the child role will inherit, all the permissions of the parent role. This can get very complex quickly. So we suggest if you're not, an advanced user of ACM that has a lot of experience with configuring parent-child relationships, then we would suggest not using that. So I just want to talk briefly about access groups. I'm not going to go into it in any depth, but when we talk about roles, it's hard not to talk about access groups. Access groups are, of course, the physical permissions of roles. So that's going to give your identities access to physical doors and possibly levels, when elevator access levels are involved. As I mentioned before, access groups cannot be assigned directly to identities. So you need to make sure after you create your access groups that you put them into a role, and then the role can be assigned to the identity. When you create access groups, of course, if you mess up and don't create the schedule first, it's not a huge deal. It's just when you configure the access group, you need to select the appropriate schedule. So if you forget, you'll just need to save the access group, go create the schedule, and then come back and add the schedule to the access group. Same with elevator access levels. Again, not a huge deal if you don't create them before the access group. It's just an extra step. So let's talk about delegations. So delegations is basically the logical access to the system. It controls what an identity can do in ACM, or whether they can do anything. Most of your identities in the system will have no delegations, because most people just need a card or a fob and they need to get through doors. You probably have a very limited set of people that will be administrators on the system, and those administrators or operators will need delegations. So something to keep in mind, as of ACM 6.4.2.9, there are 955 individual delegations that can be added to a delegations list and then assigned to a role. So that's very granular control of the system. And that can be a blessing, of course, in environments where you need to fine-tune exactly what people can do in the system. You certainly have the ability. Now it can also be a little bit complex. So in that scenario, we do give you some default delegations in the system to get you started, and then of course you can fine-tune those from there. Something to keep in mind with the super admin delegation. Of course, super admin can do anything in the system. There are two things that the system admin delegation does not do by default, and that is identity destroy batch, which is the ability to delete multiple identities in a batch process, and then of course the ability to enable duplicate pins. The reason these aren't enabled by default is because we want you to really be sure that that's what you want to do. We don't want you to accidentally delete identities or accidentally turn on duplicate pins, because once you turn on duplicate pins in the system, you cannot go back. So we make you take the extra step of adding those delegations to this super admin delegation list before you can perform those actions. So as I mentioned, there are some default delegations in the system. You know, of course, at the top, super admin, they can do everything. A lot of times super admin just gets used because maybe the end user doesn't know what permissions they want to give to certain operators. So super admin does get handed out probably too frequently. So there is a lesser administrative level, if you will, that's also in the system by default. Now I couldn't put a complete list of everything the admin delegation does, but what to keep in mind here is that it can do most of the things that super admin can do, with the exception of delete items. So if you look down, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, you can do a delegation report that shows you everything that a specific delegation can do. But you'll see that it can do most things that super admin can do, but it cannot delete many things. Also, some other notable exceptions is the admin delegation can't manage firmware. Most of the things under the appliance tab, they cannot edit, can't create user-defined fields, restore backups, etc. So there's two levels of administrator right there that you can play with and of course modify to fit the end user's needs. Now, moving away from the administrative standpoint and talking about your day-to-day operators, people that are monitoring the system, people that are entering identities in the system. We give you some default delegations to work from, for those operators as well. Enrollment operator gives you the most control of, add, create, delete identities, assign roles, access rights, do photos, do badge design, so on and so forth. A little more restrictive, of course, is the identities view and edit. You can view things within identities. You can also make some changes, but you can't do everything inside the identity. And then, of course, if you want to give somebody read-only access to be able to see a list of identities, you could use the identities view-only delegation. And then on the monitoring side, we have the monitoring operator who can, of course, acknowledge alarms, clear alarms, also includes basic door functions. They can do door grants and things like that. A lot of read-only type functions. They can look at identities but can't change them. Then, of course, the monitoring supervisor can do everything the monitoring operator can do. And then, of course, it can do additional things like edit identities, roles, access groups, etc. Okay, just a little bit more on delegation, and then I promise we'll move on. A couple tips I want to go over. I mentioned this earlier, but the delegation report and delegation comparison report. These are great tools for when you're setting up delegations, especially when you want to see the difference between two delegations. If you want to understand the differences between a monitoring operator and a monitoring supervisor, you can run a comparison report, and it's going to list everything out. You're going to have two columns, and it's going to indicate which permissions are assigned to which delegation list. Tip number 2, this is probably the most important. I probably should have made this tip number 1. ACM will give you a hint if the identity lacks the appropriate delegation to perform an action. So if you create a new delegation list, assign it to a role, assign it to an identity, that identity logs in and tries to perform some task, and they are unable to do it, then we're going to tell you right here, you're going to get a pop, well, I shouldn't say a pop-up, but you're going to get a message in the top left-hand corner that tells you exactly which delegation you need. Now, something to keep in mind, obviously this is good information because now you know you can go over and add this to the appropriate delegation list, this specific delegation, in this case, doors listing. It could be possible that you're lacking more than one delegation. So just keep in mind after you add this delegation and then you go back and try to perform the same action, you might get another delegation message here. So we don't give you we just tell you one delegation that you're lacking. So you may have to do this a couple times to find all the delegations that you need to add. So let's, Let's go to tip number 3. This is something I like to do when I'm testing delegations, just because it, especially looking at tip number 2, when you start testing, your identity with this new delegation list, there's probably going to be some troubleshooting involved. So I like to open up 2 browsers. One browser I've got opened, and I'm logged in with an identity that's part of the super admin role. And then I'll use a separate browser, and I will log in as the identity that has more restrictive delegations. And then when I get this message that says I need a certain delegation, I just pop over to my first browser, add that delegation, and then come back to the second browser, and then I can test. So it just speeds up the testing process. Tip number 4, this is what I like to do on my system. I like to leave those default delegation lists intact. Just in case I go in, I make a lot of changes, and then, I just decide I want to kind of start back at 0. Maybe the delegations just aren't working correctly. If you modify those default delegation lists, it's harder to get back. Won't say it's impossible, it's just harder to get back to that starting point. So what I like to do, create a new delegation, and then open up the delegation that I want to copy from, and then start adding the delegations to my new list and start from there. So that will wrap up delegations. So another component of roles is the routing groups. And it's indicated as routing. And routing groups control which events are routed to an operator's monitor screen. So something to keep in mind when you set up routing groups. Routing is determined at the event type level. So within an event type, you may have several different individual events within that event type. So keep that in mind. We don't filter on the event level, we filter at the event type level. And then we give you the ability to do some additional filtering by applying groups. So remember, you can do groups of hardware, you can do groups of identities, so on and so forth. So finally, just a tip when creating routing groups, as I mentioned, we are filtering at the event type level. If there is only one event and a certain event type that you want actually routed, you may need to create a new event type and then put that specific event in that event type and then only route that event type. So just keep that in mind. We give you the ability to create new event types and to monitor events to roll up under those new event types. And finally, within the roles, you have the ability to essentially, as a member of that role, you have the permissions to assign other roles to identities. And those specific roles are designated under the Assign Roles tab. So if in this example that you see on the screen, if I'm a member of the enrollment operator role, I am able to assign all of these roles under the Members tab to any other identity. So keep in mind with this, the super admin role is exempt from this rule. So if you look at the super admin role, you won't see anything listed under Assign Roles under the Members section here, but the super admin can still assign any role. Okay, so now we're going to jump over and do a quick demonstration here. Okay, let me just get back here to the beginning. So let's look at the Roles tab. So conveniently, everything involved in configuring a role, almost everything is under this tab. So here's all of my components of a role. I've got my access groups, delegations, and routing groups. So let's just take a look at the anatomy of a role real quick. So here you see I've created a new role. I created it earlier today. You can see I changed the default stop date to the year, well, same date, but year 2037. Also want to make sure that my role is installed. Otherwise, the role is not going to function and it's not going to grant any permissions to the identities assigned to it. You also have an option here. If, say, for example, this role gave access to the base building, if you will, maybe all exterior doors of the building, and everybody gets that, everybody gets that role. You could designate this as a default role, and then whenever you create a new identity, that role will be automatically assigned. So you'll also see here, and of course, we'll talk about partitions, the second half of the call today. You'll see the option to assign this role to various partitions on your system. So we'll move over to access groups. Again, most of your roles are going to contain only access groups. Now, something to keep in mind here, you're not limited to one access group. The role can have multiple access groups. So that's great if you have, let's take a school, for example, or a school system, I should say. And maybe you have an access group at each school that grants access to all doors. And, that's for, perhaps the principal and, the janitorial staff or whoever. And then you go over to the next school and you have the same thing. You got an access group that, grants access to all the doors 24/7, and that's for the principal at that school and the janitor at that school. Now, when you get to those district level folks, instead of creating a new access group, with everything, you can just combine those access groups that you've already created for each of those schools under one role. And maybe this role would be called, district-wide access. So keep that in mind. You're not limited to one role here. Then, of course, we'll move over to delegations here. You can see that I've got a delegation set, delegations demo here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to dive in and look at this specific delegation list and what's inside this list. So we're going to go up here to delegations because this is where we need to go to modify this specific delegation list. And here we go, delegations demo. And one thing, oops, let me go back just a second. Here's the list of all my delegation lists. And where it says members, that tells you how many delegations have been assigned to that specific delegation list. And if you remember, our system, as of today, has 955 delegations. So obviously, the higher the number, the more things that this delegation list can perform in the system. So let me open up our demo delegations here. Now, these are all the available delegations, and of course, these are ones that have actually been assigned to the list. The search feature will help you immensely. In this case, let's scroll through here and see something. If you needed to add some type of appliance function, you could just type in appliance here, and of course, hit the filter button, and now you're just going to see things that have, or delegations that have the word appliance in them. And of course, you could select multiple delegations at once. You can just click and drag. You can click and hold down shift and then click. Of course, the control feature works as well. You can click on one delegation, hold down the control button and click on another. So you've got a lot of different options for selecting multiple delegations at once. So this delegation, I won't say 100% mirrored it with the enrollment operator delegation, but it's pretty close. So I want to test this functionality. So you can see, just going back to delegations menu here, I've got 141 different delegations. So let me pull up a separate browser. And as soon as I find the correct one here, we will jump in. Here we go. Okay, so what I've done, let me just back up a little bit and show you what I've done here. I have created a new identity, and I've called it role demo. Let's see here. There we go. And so this role, or excuse me, this identity has the role, a role demonstration assigned to it. And specifically within that role, I have, let's go look at that role. I have the delegation, a delegations demo assigned to that role. So now let's take a look at that functionality. I've logged in as role demo, separate browser again. So if something doesn't work quite right and I get that message that says I require a certain delegation, I could just flip back to my other browser, make the change, and then come right back here and test it. So let's take a look. I can get into identities, it looks like. You know, again, I've mirrored the enrollment operator delegation list almost exactly, not completely. Let's see here. We'll just pick on somebody here. It looks like I can at least view this information, possibly change it. Let's see. Yep, looks like I can make changes. See, I can get into badging. Oops, there's something I can't do. So right here, you can see I get an error message. I clicked on timed access, and it tells me you do not have the delegation to perform timed access listing. Now, a delegation that has listing at the end of it, that will give you the ability to list the timed access features or whatever's configured under timed access. Won't necessarily give you the ability to edit it. So this is kind of thinking forward. If I want this enrollment operator to not just be able to look at timed access, we want them to be able to assign it and make changes, then there's going to be more than just the timed access listing delegation we're going to need to add. So let's go back and take a look at that. So I'm going to move my browser back over that I have. I'm logged in as with an account that is a member of the super admin role, so I can do everything. So let's go back and look at the delegations demo list here. So let's look for timed access. So I can see that I've got 4 different delegations. You know, create, delete, a couple different levels of listing. So I want this operator to be able to do everything with timed access, no restrictions. So I'm going to grab all 4 of these and move them over. I'll go back here just in case. No, that is everything. Okay, you'll see that our number increased from 141 to 145 delegations or members, as it says here. So let's go back. Again, I'm logged in as the roles demo account. And let's see what we can do now. Okay, so now when I clicked on timed access, I'm able to access this menu. I can obviously go in here and add timed access if I wanted to. I only have 1 door available to me. Of course, I could specify my start and end date and apply a schedule, and then I would be able to apply that timed access. So that gives you an idea of how delegations work. You know, again, there is some refinement, some testing that's you know, involved to get these set up. But typically, once you get delegations set up, you don't have to make a whole lot of changes to them. So when you're when you're quoting these jobs or proposing these jobs, make sure you include time for setting up delegations. And you definitely want to consult with the end user and understand, what levels of operators and administrators that they're going to have, with the system, and what they want each of those roles or operators types or administrator types to be able to do. Okay, so let's go back. I'm going to go back to the browser that I'm logged into that has super admin rights. And now we're going to go over and look at routing groups. So I set up a new routing group called a routing group demo. There is a default routing group in the system called route everything. There's no configuration options. It's kind of like the schedule that's always on. This routing group is always on. If route everything is part of your role and you're a member of that role, you're going to get all events routed to to events and alarms. So let's take a look at one that maybe doesn't have everything routed to it. Maybe you want specific events routed. In this one, I created basically this particular members of this role, that have this routing group assigned. I only want them to see invalid credential. Don't care about door held, door forced, anything else. I just want them to see invalid credentials. So I'll save that. If I wanted to further refine it, say maybe I wanted people to just see invalid credentials at a certain set of doors, I could go over here to groups. I could create a group, specifically with, just maybe a limited set of doors, and then I would apply that group here. So let's go back over to the monitor tab. And this, again, this route, I'm logged in as the super admin, if you will, and I'm seeing everything. So we got a lot of different events here. So now let's take a look at what it looks like for our role demo account that has this specific routing group assigned to it. So you can see, instead of having that long list of events that I had as super admin, all we're getting are basically invalid credentials here. So, you can configure this however you want to. Of course, I just did invalid card, but maybe this is a guard sitting at the front desk of the building, and you want that guard to just see, maybe it's forced door or door held open events, and maybe invalid credentials. And maybe you want to limit it to just the set of doors at that specific building. You could use a routing group to do that. So let's go back to our administrative account here, our super admin account, and let's take a look at one last piece of the role. And as you can see here, I've gone to assign roles. And so basically any member of the A role demonstration can assign these roles to other identities. So I'm going to go back over to my demo account that has these restricted permissions, if you will, and I'm going to create a new identity. And then we'll see what roles we have. Now I get over to the roles menu, and I can only assign these 4 roles. Even though we have many more roles in the system, I can only assign these 4 roles. So you can see roles are very powerful. It allows you to throw all those tools into one toolbox and just hand one toolbox to each identity. Now, you're not limited to just one toolbox. you can give it an identity multiple toolboxes or multiple roles, if you will. But a role makes things a lot simpler. You can organize them according to job function. If your role is accounting, you work in accounting. The role in ACM probably only has an access group, because usually people in accounting don't need to log into the access control system. If your role is security, you probably need to do some things within the access control system. You probably need to be able to monitor alarms. You might have you might manage the system or administer the system. So you may have somebody within, the security group that needs to be super admin. So roles gives you a lot of control. It's not just the container for access groups. It can do a lot more. So with that being said, I'm going to transition over to partitions now. Okay. So let's talk about partitions. So partitions are the ability to separate the system into separate administrative zones. So it's like the word says, partitioning. I like to think of it as logical partitioning or logical segmentation. For those folks on the phone that are from the IT world, when we start talking about virtual LANs or VLANs, you would take one physical switch and then you would logically segment it into separate virtual switches, if you will. But you still all that was contained on one piece of hardware. And it's kind of the same thing with partitioning. You've got one appliance, and you're creating, separate partitions, or organizational units might be another term that you could use. So keep that in mind. It's logical segmentation. I know with other access control systems out there, when they do partitioning, they actually create separate databases for each partition. We don't do that. We keep it simple. We just create logical segmentation within the same database. So some things to keep in mind when you do partitioning: all items and functionality that are assigned to a partition are available only to identities who are also assigned to that partition. So I'm going to show you the difference. There's a little bit of nuance there. You can assign an identity to a partition, and you can also make an identity an administrator of a partition. So I'll show that difference when we get into the actual demonstration. Finally, keep in mind, items not assigned to any partition belong to the unnamed or blank partition and are available to everyone. So everyone could see those things. In a partition system, if you don't partition a specific role, then everybody can see it. So let's talk about some of the prerequisites with partitioning. Just understand that the system supports up to 5 partitions without the partitioning license. So when you hit that 6th partition, you're going to need the partitioning license that I have listed here. And also keep in mind, there is not a hard limit on partitions. So once you enable that partitioning license, you could theoretically create thousands of partitions. However, we have not tested thousands of partitions. We have tested up to 100 partitions on a single appliance. If you want to create 101, that's fine. You can do that. We just can't guarantee performance beyond that 100 mark. So let's talk about partitioning planning a little bit. This kind of goes without saying, but I'll just go ahead and say it. Partitioning needs to be carefully planned. Don't just sit down one day and start partitioning the system. Think about what needs to be partitioned. What things in the system do I not want one group of people to see? Think through that. And the other thing too is keep in mind with partitioning, there's a lot of things in ACM that can be partitioned. I can't say absolutely everything. There are some exceptions, but there's a lot of things that can be partitioned, but you don't have to. You know, keep it simple. If you don't need to partition, you know, roles and access groups, then don't. You know, maybe you're in an environment where you just need to partition doors. Great, just partition the doors. You don't need to go any further. Something else we do recommend exercising some caution when it comes to partitioning identities. It can get kind of complex, and especially if you have identities that, you know, maybe you're partitioning by building, for example. And, you know, you put all the identities that are in building A in partition A, and all the identities in partition B, you know, or all the members of building B and partition B, and then you have all of a sudden you have people that that are identities in building B, and they need to go to building A. That gets a little bit difficult. Then you have to have an administrator that's administrator over both partitions to be able to assign that person access. So if you don't need to partition identities, then don't. Something else to keep in mind, you know, as I mentioned before, partitioning is a way to logically segment the system. And what we're doing essentially is we're hiding items. You know, we're not preventing items from one partition from interacting with items in another partition. So think about that. Where this sometimes comes up is with holidays and schedules. You know, you can partition holidays and schedules. You could hide holidays from one partition. And they can't see that holiday, but maybe that holiday is configured as type 1 and your schedule is, you know, adhering to type 1 holidays. Well, now you've had a holiday scheduled that affects your doors and you didn't even know that that holiday existed. So just be careful. Just remember it's hiding items. It's not preventing certain items from you know, running or working. Also keep in mind reports cannot be partitioned at this time. So there's one of those exceptions. Right now, if you enable reports for a certain user, you know, you allow them, you give them the delegations to run reports, they will see information across all partitions. So definitely keep that in mind. Something else to consider, you know, partitions, they can be created easily and they can also be deleted. So if you make a mistake, you set up partitioning, it's really not what the end user wanted, you can simply delete it. And that is also different from some of the other solutions out there where they create separate databases and things like that. In those instances, partitioning can be very difficult to unravel or delete. So keep that in mind. Still requires careful planning, but you know, you can certainly undo partitioning if you need to. And one of the things I'll mention, I didn't put it on the slide deck, but it's probably important to note. There's a lot of times that, you know, whatever you're trying to achieve with partitioning can be oftentimes achieved with delegation. So, you know, make sure you ask those questions of your end user. You know, when they say, I don't want such and such to be able to, you know, change door modes. Okay, well, do you not want them to be able to change door modes across the system? Because if that's the case, you can take care of that with delegation. If they say, no, well, I need them to be able to change door modes for doors, you know, at their facility, well, then you probably have to look at partitioning. So what I always recommend when you think you're going down the partitioning path, look at it, you know, and see if you can accomplish what the end user wants with delegations, possibly routing groups. before you go into partitioning. So with that being said, we'll jump into just a short demo on partitioning. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to have, as we did with the last demo, I'm going to have one system that I'm logged into with an account that's a member of the super admin role, and then I will have another account that I log into that's just a member of specific partition. So let me start with the administrative login. So I'm going to look at partitions first. So under roles, there is the option to configure partitions. So you can see in my system, I've already configured 3 partitions, building A, building B, and building C. So let's open one of these up. So earlier I talked about when we talk about identities and partitions, there's kind of 2 different pieces of that. One is what identities are administrators on certain partitions. So here we're creating the partition. So in this case, building A. Then I would select the specific identities that can see things that are in partition or building A rather. But when we go to identities, you'll see that you can also make certain identities a member of a partition as well. So there's a distinction, just keep that in mind. So here we've got, I think it's 16 different users that can see what's in building A. And then I have, similarly configured for building B and building C. So now what I've done, I have not partitioned the entire system. I've just partitioned a few things just for demonstration purposes. So let's go through, I'm going to look at doors first. So you'll see that I have, I'll click on some of these doors and show you. You'll see that I have this door. It is in building A partition. That's our back door. Let's see, grab another door here. I think this Schlage board door 1 is in building B. And I know I've got some in building C. So I'm logged in as the, again, account that's a member of the super admin role. So I can see everything. These are all the doors on the system. So now let's log in as building A and see what we see. Okay, building A. Well, I'm going to have to spell building correctly. There we go. Okay, so I configured the user to go directly to the doors menu just to speed things up, and you can see here, I can only see doors that are a member of partition A. So I've got, what is that, 5 doors? If I go back here and look at my administrator login, I've got a bunch more doors. So partitioning has allowed me to limit which doors I can see and which doors I can interact with. So here, I believe this operator has permission to do a door grant. Yes. So I can further refine this. So I've limited through partitioning. I've limited this particular operator to just see the doors in partition A, or building A, I should say. But if I wanted to refine this, maybe I don't want them to be able to do door grants or door mode changes. Then I can go to delegations and make those changes. So partitions and delegations can work together. So now let's take a look at, let's go over here to identities. Now I just partitioned a couple identities just, just so you all could see them. I'm logged in as building A, and this particular user is a member of building A partition. Now you'll notice when I go in and look at this, under partitions, I have the ability, because I'm an administrator of partition A, I have the ability to either not partition this identity or to put this identity in building A. But I don't have the options, since I'm not an administrator, on the building B partition or the building C partition. So you'll notice that you don't have building B or building C because those are members of a separate partition. So let's go back over here. Now I've just opened up my account that, again, as a member of the super admin role, so I can see everything. I can see all of these accounts regardless of which partition they're in. So here I can see building B and building C. So with that being said, I know we're down to like 9 minutes left. Let's see if there's any questions. Or if we've gotten all of them answered.
Yeah, we answer. I think there is just a last one in there. If you want to take a look at that.
Should each partition have a holiday type if each partition has different holidays? Yeah, I think the first thing I would consider is not partitioning holidays and schedules. Just, I don't know, Francisco, do you have any better suggestions there? It gets a little bit complicated when you have partitions with holidays and schedules.
Yeah, I would, for holidays, usually is for company-wide, right? So you could have different businesses, unless you have different operations in different countries, then yes, then I would use partition just to kind of hide the holidays. But then within the holidays, you can use the type of holidays to separate different organizations, right? Holiday type 1, type 1 through 8, right? So I can separate the holidays for what applies where, right? So I would handle like that. Otherwise, that would be a global setting for me, and I would limit the ability of someone going to holiday schedules and holidays, which should be anyway, right? You should limit that as much as possible, because otherwise people will start to creating or changing schedules and holidays, and this could affect the entire system. So you got to be very careful with that. Rick, I hope we answered your question. Yeah, sure.
Let's see. When using partitions, I've noticed that search output under monitor is not being filtered. Is there a plan to adjust that? Take a look here. Oh, when using partitions. Okay, so partitions, there we go. Sorry, I was confusing that. With partitioning, and I should have mentioned this, the events. Events are filtered through routing groups. Even in a partition system, if you only want people to see certain events, you're going to want to filter that through routing groups. And I don't know, Bill, are you seeing that? I don't know if you're probably on mute. I don't know if you're seeing the events properly.
I am seeing it. And I think really what that question boils down to is transactional data currently does not honor the partitions. So for example, if I wanted to run a report or search, use that search function under monitor to search out all the activity within the last, say, 15 minutes, it would show me all activity regardless of the partitions I'm allowed to see. So yes, to answer your question, that is correct. We currently do not honor partitioning as it relates to transactional data. However, it is on our roadmap to do that in the very near future, hopefully by the end of this year.
Perfect. Thanks, Bill. Yeah, and that kind of falls under reports as well. Reports is not currently honoring partitions. Any other questions?
You touch a good point there in reports, right? So usually what we tell customers to do is limit the access to reports, and you can always create or schedule reports to run automatically, and you can filter those reports. Let's say a transactional report, right? I want to see all the activities for building A. I can go and create a report, filter just for that building A, and send that to the operator, the person who needs that report, right? And then for building B, the same way. I would just create another one with certain filters, schedule those reports. They can run. It can be automatically delivered to those operators. And you would just lock everyone out of the report functionality. Just leave the administrator have access to that.
Perfect. We've got another question. Is there a defined best practice on designing, I'm assuming, partitions? I don't know if I have anything else to add other than, what we stated. Keep it simple. Only partition the things that you really need to partition. Be very careful when partitioning identities. Don't partition identities unless you really need to. And if you do, make sure the end user understands what the limitation is. If you have people that need to go between partitions, so to speak, or need to access buildings that are configured under another partition. Let's see, all the above. So I guess that means best practices on partitioning as well as roles, delegations.
Rob, this is Bill again. Just to interject real quick, when it comes to partitioning, the very first thing I kind of coach people to do is determine first, is partitioning truly needed? Is what is the problem you're trying to solve, and does partitioning solve it? So get that question cleared up in the very beginning. That's the first and foremost, best practice. And then once you get through that, everything that Rob mentioned, don't get partition happy and partition everything. Only partition the items you need. Combine partitioning with things like routing groups and role assignments and things like that, so that you're using delegations to limit them from other areas, so you don't have to partition those areas. For example, if I don't have access to the roles section of the UI, why would I partition anything that's in that section? If the person can't get there and doesn't have the permissions to do anything, then you have no reason to partition those items. So always partition the minimal amount of stuff you need. It'll help minimize on the overhead administration of the system in the long run for both you and your customer.
Awesome, thanks, Bill.
And I'm going to illustrate this point very quickly about the identities, right? Why we suggest you don't partition identities. Let's see if I can do this very quickly. So imagine that Rob and I, we are in separate buildings, and we the system administrator of two different buildings, right? He's in his partition, I'm in my partition. He can go, let's say that we have the system, the identities partition. So I have my set of identities in my building, and he has his set of identities in his building. Now, if we partition identities, here's the problem. Oh, no, it's not a problem. It just becomes harder for you to do administration, right, of the system. And the reason is this. So let's say that Rob has someone in his building that he wants to come to my building, right? So he's going to try to add a role or give that person permission to access my building. Well, he's in his partition. He can't see my roles. He can't see my door, so he won't be able to. Then he's going to call me and says, hey, add this person to your roles there so he can have access to your doors. Well, I can't see his identity, his person under his partition identities, right? Because it is in his partition. So now Rob and I need someone above us that has visibility to the two partitions to go and add that person. So that's the type of administrative burden you're gonna have when you start to partition a lot of things. And as Bill just said, just partition as minimum as possible, because remember that you can use a combination of partitions, routing, rows, and delegations to limited people ability to access the system. That's it. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Francisco. So it looks like we are at the end of the hour. So Jared, are you still on the line? Do you want to talk about Friday if you are?
Yeah, I am. Friday, we've got what got sent out in the update for the webinar. We're actually changing that like we did last week. We're going to be talking about some of the ways that ACM and ACC concurrently working together are going to help us all get back to work. So we're going to be talking about some of the solutions that we have in our upcoming release of ACM 6.6, some of the cool new features there, and then I'm going to be showing off a pretty interesting application using our facial recognition with ACC as a factor in our access control to create some touchless type solutions for access control. So not going to want to miss that, guys. Friday, noon Pacific time. So for all you guys on the East Coast, it'll be 3 o'clock your time, and looking forward to seeing you there.
Awesome. Thanks, Jared. And thanks everyone for joining. Everyone have a great afternoon. Thank you.